Has the dawn ever seen your eyes?
It's December 1970, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer are in London, presenting their audience with some pictures from an exhibition. The piece is an adaptation of the Russian composer Modest Mogorsky's 1847 composition, and ELP's London show was filmed for theatrical release, which came a few years later. Now, despite their usual jaw-dropping performance, the band were rightly dissatisfied with both the audio, which they felt was poorly recorded, and the visuals, which are plagued by some shoddy camera work and dreadfully dated and intrusive psychedelic film effects.
Lead me from tortured dreams, childhood themes of nights alone. Wipe away endless years, childhood tears as dry as stone.
The Pictures project was placed on hold, and a telling interview by Greg Lake around this time claimed that the band were going to cease playing the piece. Lake was ever conscious that releasing a classical adaptation as the band's next record would lead to further comparisons being made between ELP and Emerson's previous band, The Nice, a group that made their name from reinterpretations of classical music. In addition to this, the fact that the band's recently released debut album was itself half classical covers led Greg to believe that if they were to prove their critics wrong, then the band's next release had to be all their own work. Even in the band's early days, ELP bashing was rife in the music press, and it was felt that for every sellout concert they had, there was a barrage of criticism thrown in also. But despite these critics and a sign of things to come, the band featured in the 1970 Melody Maker end-of-year poll as the best newcomers. It's an astonishing feat considering that when the survey for the poll was taken, the band had not yet released a record and had only actually played 2 live shows. Keith had been playing various phrases and melodies for what would become Tarkus during improvisations with his previous band, The Nice, and he developed these more and more over ELP's 1970 autumn tour. Greg Lake initially had reservations about what was originally planned as an elongated instrumental piece, and he felt that the track's odd time signatures wouldn't connect well with audiences, and he told Keith in no uncertain terms that the piece should be best shelved for a solo album. Ever the businessman, however, Lake was also conscious that expensive time had already been booked at London's Advision recording studios, and in January 71 he and his 2 bandmates headed off there in an attempt to bring Keith's idea to life. Once all 3 started work together, Greg warmed more to the music, which he and Carl helped to rearrange and give it a more faster and hard-edged pace. Greg also felt that the musical themes didn't quite have a strong enough and unifying concept, so he created lyrics that reflected Keith's original idea of war, peace, revolution and reflection more. It's an astonishing testament really to this band's skill and work rate to consider that the entire Tarkus suite was mostly written, almost entirely arranged and fully recorded within one single week. This short time was a deliberate move as the band wanted to capture a sense of urgency in the music, something that they really succeeded in doing. And it wasn't the first time that Emerson had done this, with the Nice's Five Bridges suite also being written within a similar 1 week timescale. The band then paused for a few weeks, during which time Greg Lake stated that they had no idea what the second side of the next album was to be, claiming in an interview that they were re-entering the studio in February with literally nothing planned for it. A month later in March, the band returned to touring again with Pictures at an Exhibition back on the bill, and at their Newcastle show they decided to re-record the piece, but this time with their own equipment and engineers. By April, there was still doubt as to what the final shape of the Tarkus album would be, with reports that the recent live recording of Pictures would take up one side of the album, suggesting that side 2 of Tarkus, as we know it, would have been completely scrapped. One thing that there can be no doubt over is the band's astonishing work rate, which seemed to have left Keith with little time even for shaving, as is evidenced by the huge beard that he grew over these spring months. So, with more notes packed into it than most bands can muster up in a lifetime, let's unleash the beast that is Tarkus and let the battle commence. Tarkus is born to the ethereal sound of Greg Lake's voice fused with a cloud of cymbals. The weaving drum pattern implies the newly born creature darting around like it's on a seek and destroy mission. Keith has described how he heard Carl Palmer practicing an unusual repetitive drum pattern, and he felt it matched a melody that he already had in his head, and it's from the fusion of these two things that the main theme of Tarkus was born. The opening was originally called Frustration. It's a reference to both its difficult 5/4 time signature and also the frustrating aspect of which the whole suite was based around, namely the futility of war and revolutions that also fail to deliver. The whole band's playing is superb, with wonderful melodic interplay and a driving, threatening rhythm that provides an incredible opening to our story. The creature's saga continues with the more reflective Stones of Years. Keith's elongated chords provide the perfect texture to the accusatory tone of the lyrics, which question the futility of Tarkus's mindless aggression. Greg's luscious and soothing voice acts as a conscience for Tarkus and presents the creature with a series of rhetorical questions, kind of like a disappointed father lecturing an angry teenager.
Had you talked to the winds of time, then you'd know how the waters rhyme. Taste of wine, how can you know where you've been in time? You'll see the sign and realize your sin.
Keith designed Tarkus to live in a post-nuclear world where it encountered other creatures that had been distorted through radiation and first up as a spider-like monster with built-in rocket launchers. Whilst not the most profound and well executed of concepts within progressive rock, the musical themes and catchy lyrics and memorable artwork are, I feel, enough to create a fun and exciting world that help visualise and drive the music along. A cascading keyboard run heralds the arrival of a dive-bombing mechanical pterodactyl, the dreaded iconoclast. Carl's thunderous tribal rhythm evokes images of Tarkus frantically trying to dodge bombs from above. However, like all who come before him, the foe is no match for our beast, who proudly moves on to the next section of the track. Greg has referenced that the next part of the suite was based on an earlier song of his titled Black Mass, and the lyrics here seem to question the futility of war and religion in general, as if perhaps Tarkus's next victim was begging for its own life to be spared.
The preacher said a prayer, save every single hair on his head. He's dead. The minister of hate had just arrived too late to be spared. Who cares?
Its pleas, however, are fruitless, and like the others, he is destroyed by our angry armadillo, who feels emboldened and hurtles away across the bleak, striped landscape. The repetitive drums and organ here really seem to capture the idea of the rolling tank threads and growing threat.
The weaver in the web that he made.
This rhythm takes on the feel of a tribal dance, which sets the scene for Tarkus to finally meet his match with the arrival of the dreaded Manticore. The music here gives the impression of the two creatures jumping and jostling and prowling around each other, with the Manticore moving into position to deliver its fateful crashing blow. The battlefield section mirrors Stones of Years and questions how little was gained from the conflict. Both the lyrics and the music to this aftermath were written by Greg Lake, and when he played it live, he seamlessly weaved King Crimson's epitaph into it.
Confusion will be my epitaph.
Finally, the defeated Tarkus retreats wounded to a river. A keen scuba diver, Keith manages to recreate a kind of squelchy underwater type of music with his Moog synth, whilst the arrangement itself takes on a marching sound, suggesting that Tarkus still possesses his original military-like strength. Perhaps this section could have been a fitting end to the piece, however the main eruption theme reappears, suggesting that Tarkus may have been reborn and will live to fight another day. Tarkus is an astonishing sidelong epic that rivals and arguably beats most other things from this era. It's a masterpiece that its main writer Keith Emerson was rightly very proud of, but will the rest of the album stand up to it? Well, before we find out, let's take a refreshing break.
Now it's time for ice cream. Or maybe some nuts. A cool glass of orange. Why not try a hot dog? Or the real thing, a cool, refreshing Coca-Cola. From the sales staff and in the foyer. Now.
Side 2 of Tarkus is often accused of being just filler to complete the album. This is an unfair and inaccurate assessment. However, opening with this lightweight comedy number doesn't do the band any favours and immediately feels like a bit of a letdown compared to the heights of side 1. Here, Emerson's honky-tonk playing evokes his love of Nashville pianist Floyd Kramer, whilst Carl's clapping hands give the whole thing a kind of rustic, laid-back vibe. Sounding suspiciously like those of King Crimson's Pete Sinfield, Greg's sexually suggestive lyrics come across like they were literally thrown together as he was singing them, and I don't think they were designed to be overanalyzed too much, and certainly not 50 years later.
Talked with his sister and spoke in a whisper, threatened to fist her if she didn't come clean, jumped on the mother just like a brother, ask one another if the other's a queen.
I think it's wrong to judge aspects of the past by a modern day moral stance, viewpoints which themselves will appear questionable in the future. And while some may consider the lyrics here to be crude or even offensive today, remember that this was 1971 and only 4 years earlier, being a bender would in fact have sent poor old Jeremy to prison. With lyrics about mysticism and clairvoyance, Bitch's Crystal opens with the tinkling sound of a celeste. This was a keyboard that struck metal plates rather than piano strings, and as such it creates a magical, dreamlike musical box sound. This is how side 2 should have opened. With a similar pace and urgency, this track rivals anything on side 1, and it could have easily fit into the Tarkus suite if needed. Keith has cited Dave Brubeck as an influence in his playing, with Carl consciously trying to recreate skipping and rolling sound of Brubeck's drummer Dave Morello.
Tortured spirits cry, fears in their eyes, ghostly images die.
Along with Greg belting out the lyric of Full Throttle and Keith's pounding piano, this fantastic song hurtles away like a runaway steam train.
Evil learning, people burning, savage casting, no one lasting, witchcraft sadness, madness sunning their minds!
One of the original names proposed for the trio Emerson, Lake and Palmer was Trinity, and religious themes and church organ textures are common across their catalogue. Here, however, we have a hymn that is from the perspective of an atheist, someone who denies the existence of God. The lyrics are slightly awkward in parts, with Keith and Carl rightly unsure about the inclusion of the slightly distracting 6 million Jews line, but they left it in on Greg's insistence.
How was the earth conceived? Infinite space. Is there such a place?
Keith's organ playing uses Bach's Toccata in F major, and he plays the same organ that he used on the band's first album. A Melody Maker article from August 1970 shows Keith playing the organ that was housed at St Mark's Church in the St John Wood area of London, and not Finchley, as was stated in the article. The article says that he was using it to record the band's first album, namely the Three Fates track. This church was around the corner from the Abbey Road recording studios, and one can only assume therefore that it was known to other musicians and used by them around this time. Unfortunately, the organ and most of the church itself was sadly burnt down in 2023.
It's the only way.
The piece leads directly into Infinite Space, which sees some nice Emerson piano soloing over Carl's repeated drum pattern. It was designed to give a more upbeat and pleasant coda to the weightier track that precedes it, and succeeds in doing so. Keith has claimed that this track comes from his love of Led Zeppelin, and his stabbing Hammond playing evokes his period with the Nice. It's a strange number that I feel is both underdeveloped and overcooked at the same time, and it's arguably a little repetitive, as if the band just really wanted to get this album finished and move on.
Save me from this shallow land. Take me out and turn my time. Track me from this burning sand. Show me those that understand.
I think there's some breathing space would have helped this track, and personally I think they did this sort of thing better on tracks like Knife Edge on the first album and Living Sin on the next. There's no doubt, however, that we get our money's worth here, with Greg screaming out his vocals like his life depends on it, and the music itself is about as full on, foot to the pedal prog as you can get. The album's closer illustrates how ELP and lots of bands from this period have made serious lapses in quality control sometimes. The original plan was to conclude the side with the crowd-pleasing Nut Rocker, and I think everyone would agree that would have been a far better choice. Are You Ready, Eddie is a reference to the band's studio engineer Eddie Offord, and it was a one-off jam recorded by the band to celebrate the conclusion of the Tarkus recording. It's basically a cover of Little Richard's The Girl Can't Help It. The ham or cheese line at the end was a quip that was quoted by a cafe owner that the band visited while they were recording at Advision. If it has any merit, it's that the track at least showcases the carefree spirit of the time and an age when musicians were allowed to literally put anything out on a record, regardless of the time and money that they spent on it or its potential commercial appeal.
They've only got aim or cheese.
Ham or cheese?
The story of the album's cover began when Keith Emerson spotted a small doodle on a sketchbook belonging to a graphic artist called William Neal. The sketch of a machine gun with a piano key gun belt was never meant to be a proposal for the cover, but Keith liked the way that it combined music and aggression, and the artist was invited to develop other ideas on the Tarkus music and lyrics, which were partially in development. At the point the band saw Neil's artwork, the album and title suite didn't yet have a name, and Keith's initial idea was a tank, and then a tank animal, and finally the armoured armadillo. He knew that the creature's name should begin with a T, the T of tank, and then he thought of Tarka before realising that it sounded too close to a well-known English novel about a playful otter. Therefore, he twisted this name to give it a more aggressive edge. Artist Neil offers a slightly different version of events, and he claims that the Tarkus name was a mixture of two words, namely carcass, as in the decaying bones of the dead animal seen on the album's cover, and a second word called Tartarus, which is a realm from Greek mythology and the darkest place of the underworld of Hades, further underscoring our creature's warmongering and evil intent. Neil was given an early mix of the album to take away, and he drew the artwork whilst listening to it. And it was the artist's idea not to include the heavily marketable ELP name on the cover, and he claims that he was quite insistent on this, arguing that the band's name would detract from the power of the image and the overall concept. I think in hindsight he was right, and it's a wonderfully powerful image. In later interviews, members of ELP have claimed that William Neal actually killed himself, but this wasn't the case, although he did drop out of the business totally, going to live in the Scottish Highlands as a watercolour landscape painter without an armadillo in sight. Tarkus was released in the UK in June 1971, but it was delayed until August in the States so that it could coincide with a huge tour over there, which took up the remainder of that year. But for a band barely a year old, the album was a huge success and reached number 1 in both the UK and prog-loving Italy. It made the top 10 in America, as it did in a host of other countries. For the band's 1972 tours, a huge model Tarkus accompanied the band on stage. It fired polystyrene balls at the audience, and one night the machine backfired and it covered Keith's grand piano in thousands of tiny plastic pieces, resulting in the show being halted so it could be cleaned. Other props and characters were known to make an appearance, including a model of the pterodactyl iconoclast that flew over the band's heads whilst they played. Personally, what I love about this album best is the sheer sense of fun that the band are having, and also the sheer balls to do anything that they wanted. Now granted, this trait was common with lots of bands in this era, but ELP just seemed to have the edge on them all. If Spinal Tap took it up to 11, then for ELP it was 12. In an interview around this time, Greg Lake references that the band were completely shattered, and it's not hard to see why. In the calendar year of 1971 alone, they wrote and recorded both the Tarkus and Trilogy albums. They travelled the world on several global tours and produced a live album for good measure. A planned Pictures ballet score was also proposed but failed to materialise. To crown the year off, the prestigious Melody Makers End of Year poll saw the band scoop a host of awards, including Best Group and Best Album in Tarkus, as well as a host of individual awards for Keith, Carl and Greg individually. Now this is against some pretty stiff competition in what is now generally regarded as the single greatest year in rock music's history. The commercial and critical fortunes of this band would be a roller coaster in future years. However, at this point in time, they seem to stand head and shoulders above all of their rivals, growling like the lords of the jungle, the kings of the pack. For the time being at least, the musical monsters that were Emerson, Lake, Palmer and Tarkus really did rule the world.